Riccardo is a very special speaker to me because he is also a member of our European Research Council team and has been a prolific contributor to the project that's sponsoring this conference. He has a number of critical editions of John of La Rochelle coming out, John of La Rochelle's Tractatus de Legibus, Summa de Divinis Nominibus, Summa de Articulis Fides, and in addition has published already extensively before then a fantastic book on the will in early scholastic thought and on Burgundio of Pisa, edited the Council of Vienna documents. The list of erudite publications could really go on and on. It's a huge honor and joy to work with Riccardo, to count him as my friend and as really my closest colleague and collaborator at the moment. So I have, I'm really in your debt on so many levels, but also for your willingness to present a paper on the form of the body, John Peckham's critique of Aquinas' doctrine of the soul in the Summa. And I don't want to take any more of your time, Riccardo. So please go for it. And I'd also use this moment to advertise that Riccardo will be your host on the last week. And so you can look forward to that.
So thank you so much, Lydia, for the too kind presentation. And also let me thank Felipe for his presentation, because my presentation would be some sort of gloss to what he has already said about Peckham. You've received the handout with the text through which I will go in doing my presentation. Now, the condemnation of 8 doctrinal propositions that John Peckham, Archbishop of Canterbury, issued on 13 April 1286 has been the subject of different historical evaluations among scholars of medieval philosophy and theology. In the decades between the 2 world wars, when a new stage of development of neo-Thomism rested upon historical researches based on text and documents, Peckham's act was qualified as plainly belonging to the anti-Thomism that grew in the decades after Aquinas' death concerning the doctrinal value of the achievements of the Dominican master. Polemon of the Franciscan primate of the English Church against Aquinas' doctrine of the unity of the substantial form as part of the radical opposition between the 2 mendicant orders, which will provide a net distinction between Thomists and anti-Thomists, or more properly speaking, between Thomism and Augustinism. With respect to these anti-Thomistic understanding of Peckham's position, the researches dedicated to the 13th century censors and condemnations of doctrines taught in the university milieu have provided a different point of view. For instance, the studies of Luca Bianchi suggest to combine the intellectual debates of the theological and philosophical struggles among the masters with the rising of a matter of political and religious control over the university, and largely speaking over the education and learning. Such a historical reading replaces the 1286 condemnation in the praxis of the ecclesiastical authority to make use of the power of survey and control over the Orthodox faith with respect to the teaching provided in the studia of the religious orders or in the universities. A quite different understanding of Peckham's initiative can be found in Alain Bourreau's study, which presents the Archbishop's doctrinal concern as plainly coherent with his own theological mind. More in detail, Bourreau suggests that Peckham's engagement, firstly in the debates and later on in the condemnations, was part of a larger movement against Aquinas' doctrinal heritage, and more specifically against the theological heirs of the Dominican master, such as Richard Knapwell, who taught and defended the doctrine of the unity of the substantial form, despite its puzzling implications with respect to the body of Christ after the crucifixion and death, and the nature of the Eucharistic sacrament. Moreover, the French historian stresses the strong biographical continuity between the teaching of the Franciscan master in Paris, Oxford, and in the Papal Curia, and the operator as Archbishop of Canterbury, presents the 1286 as the coherent result of a strong doctrinal conviction developed in time through the teaching and debating of the career of a master who eventually assumed the role of primate of the English Church. Caleb Calais' recent focus on the very contents of Peckham's text on the issue of the unity or plurality of the substantial forms stresses the crucial relevance of the Franciscan's intellectual biography, noting his deep engagement in the major discussions which involved the university since 1270. The recovery of the debate on the status of the mendicants with the Guild of the Masters, the issue of the eternity of the word, the reaction against the unicity of the intellect, the understanding of poverty. All these interpretations of Peckham's censor of 1286 assume a basic continuity between the discussions among the masters and the intervention of the ecclesiastical authority to fix the orthodox faith and forbid the teaching of doctrines such as that on the unity of substantial form, which are seen as heterodox or heretic. It is certainly clear that the great censors of the 13th century concerning the university teaching rest upon solid doctrinal bases, which are the result of the work of commissions of experts, the Acts of 1241, 1270, and the notorious condemnations of 1277 issued by Etienne Tampier in Paris and Kilwerby in Oxford, shows a combination of exercise of the ecclesiastical magisterium of a bishop and the theological support provided by masters. However, scholars have clarified how censoring or condemning certain statements or doctrines within the 13th century university is a legal act which involves the engagement of a process similar to a synod and produces a document which has certain specific literary features. This state of things places the censors and condemnations, including the one of 1286, concerning the unity of substantial form, on a different level with respect to the teaching of the masters. The debate that took place at the university over a puzzling doctrine and the definition of heresy made by the ecclesiastical authority were linked to two different kinds of magisterium of which the 13th century masters and bishops are well aware. In the light of these remarks, it would be useful to reconsider the supposed continuity between Peckham's teaching as a master and his governance of the English Church, to which the 1286 condemnation belongs. Certainly the Archbishop of Canterbury didn't abandon his doctrinal convictions, but his exercise of the bishop's authority was driven by needs and concerns different from those of the magister. Such a historiographic premise can help in dealing more closely with Peckham's position on the issue of the substantial form. What emerges from his theological writings, especially the Tractatus de Anima, the Questiones quod Liberales, and the Questiones de Anima, has to be replaced within the framework of the doctrinal confrontation of the 1270s on this issue, which moved from Thomas Aquinas' careful presentation of the unity of the substantial form in the first part of the Summa Theologiae. Peckham's theological production deals with the need to face the philosophical innovation over the understanding of the body-soul relation introduced by Aristotle and his Arabic readers, mainly Avicenna and Averroes. At the same time, in dealing with such an analysis, the master recovers a well-established tradition rooted in the intellectual engagement of the early Franciscan masters and fixed in the Summa Fratris Alexandri. A survey of Peckham's position, which assumes this point of view, will clarify the place of the Franciscan master in the 1270s discussion on the nature and role of the soul in the human composite, but also suggests to rethink the way such an academic matter became an issue in establishing the Orthodox faith. The introduction of the Aristotelian philosophical heritage in the 13th century Latin Europe offered the possibility to directly deal with the conceptual lexicon that provided a new description and understanding of nature. More in detail, the metaphysical principle of the inseparable couple of matter and form was seen as the key to offer an explanation of the substances based not on the simple combination of the four elements, but rather on a universal structure according to which a body, and mainly a living body, is the result of the action of a form that organizes properly structures the matter. Applying this principle to the human composite, the soul is seen as the form that gives an order to matter and gives life to it. This approach agrees with Aristotle's definition of the soul in the De Anima, according to which the soul is the form of a natural body, and it is also the act of the body, so that the soul is the prime act of a natural body which has life in potency. In question 75 of the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas assumes these elements within a definition of the role of the human soul with respect to the body, and starts by explaining that the soul is the first principle of life in the sense that it is not a body, but the act of the body. Closely following the implication of these considerations, Aquinas stresses the nature of the soul, which has no matter. On the contrary, since the soul is defined as the form of a body, it is impossible to give to the soul any kind of matter or of material elements, because matter is pure potentiality, while the soul is the act of a body. Focusing on the human soul, that is the intellectual soul, Aquinas notes that the form-matter relation remains unalterated. He notes, I quote, "It is clear that whatever is received into something is received according to the condition of the recipient. Now, a thing is known in as far as its form is in the knower. But the intellectual soul knows a thing in its nature absolutely. For instance, it knows a stone absolutely as a stone, and therefore the form of a stone absolutely as to its proper formal idea is in the intellectual soul. Therefore, the intellectual soul itself is an absolute form, and not something composed of matter and form. For if the intellectual soul were composed of matter and form, the forms of things could be received into it as individuals, and so it would only know the individual, just as it happens with the sensitive powers which receive forms in a corporeal organ. Since matter is the principle by which forms are individualized, it follows, therefore, that the intellectual soul and every intellectual substance which has knowledge of forms absolutely is exempt from composition of matter and form." End of quote. Aquinas argues that the human soul, that is the intellectual soul, is the form of the body precisely because it has no matter and it is the principle that gives life. This latter concept requires to be adapted to each kind of substance. Since to understand is the proper act of the human life, it is the intellectual soul that gives form to the human body. Aquinas largely argues this in order to avoid the risk of separating the potential intellect from the body, following Averroes, or of considering the body-soul relation just in the Platonic terms of the relation between what is moved and the mover. The Dominican master concludes, I quote, "There remains therefore no other explanation than that given by Aristotle, namely that this particular man understands because of the intellectual principle in his form. Thus, from the very operation of the intellect, it is made clear that the intellectual principle is his form. Thus, from the very operation of the intellect, it is made clear that the intellectual principle is united to the body as its form. The same can be clearly shown from the nature of the human species, for the nature of each thing is shown by its operation. Now, the proper operation of the human being as human being is to understand, because he thereby surpasses all other animals. Thus, also Aristotle concludes that the ultimate happiness of the human being must consist in this operation as properly belonging to him. The human being must therefore derive his species from that which is the principle of this operation, but the species of anything is derived from its form. It follows, therefore, that the intellectual principle is the proper form of the human being." End of quote. Aquinas asserts a clear and complete hylomorphism which distinguishes two essential components of the human being as substance, that is, the soul and the body. He does this by fully qualifying the soul as the form of the body and arguing that in the case of the human being, it is precisely the human soul, that is the intellectual soul, which is the form of the body, giving life to it and making it possible to exercise the act that qualifies human life, understanding. Certainly, this allows the Dominican to display an alternative to an idea of the human soul as the form of the body which assumes body and soul as two different substances and makes the intellect a sort of separate substance, which would be unique for all mankind. However, it marks a real novelty with respect to the way the notion of substantial form was used in the 1230s and in the 1240s, that is, in the early reception of the philosophical sources concerning the doctrine of the soul. The text of the Summa Theologiae introduce a strong continuity between the notion of perfection of the body and that of form of the body, assuming as crucial the fact that the soul has no matter at all, but is pure form, and that the body has no form or principle other than the soul. Such an approach gave rise to a series of problems concerning the consequences that an understanding of the human soul as pure form has on the processes of generation of the human being and of his corruption and death. Which is the status of the, for instance, of the embryo, where certainly is present a soul with both the vegetative and sensible functions, but not the intellect? How does this hulomorphic being with matter and form become a human being that is something with a completely different form? Does the infusion of the human soul cause the destruction of the pre-existing souls provided by the vegetative and sensitive capabilities? Similar questions raised also about the final stage of human life. What is the body once the soul is no more its form? How it can continue to subsist as organized matter without the formal principle of the intellectual soul? How just one single substantial form is consistent with the existence of both the embryo and the dead body? It is along these lines of questioning the doctrine of the unity of the substantial form that all along the 1270s, the masters discussed about the way the human soul can be qualified as the form of the body, providing a development of different arguments to which John Peckham offered his own contribution. During the 1270 and his election to the See of Canterbury in 1279, the Franciscan master completed his scholarly career in Oxford, in Paris, Oxford, and in the studium linked to the Papal Curia. Peckham developed his own position, assuming 2 points of reference: the hulomorphism as the basic structure of reality, and the recovery of the Augustinian distinction between soul and body according to substance. Moving himself between these two poles, the master faced 3 major issues: the introduction of the plurality of forms, the understanding of the relation between body and soul, the role attributed to the rationes seminales in dealing with each of these 3 issues. In dealing with each of these 3 issues, Peckham constantly confronts himself with his doctrinal background, whereas we shall see the Summa Frateris Alexandri has a central place. In the Tractatus de Anima, as well as in the Questiones Quas Libertalis and in the Questiones de Anima, Peckham fully agreed with the so-called universal hulomorphism, that is the idea that the Aristotelian conceptual scheme of the relation between matter and form represents the basic universal structure of the existing beings. The idea that there is just one and single matter common to all the corporeal beings, however, does not involve that each being has just one single substantial form. On the contrary, the complex structure of the body, as well as the idea that the soul herself continues to exist also without a body, require to think to a plurality of forms or to one substantial form which has different degrees. To clarify his position, Peckham distinguishes between the forma prima substantialis, which is the cause of the unity of a being, from the action of other forms, namely the formae naturales, which are the cause of physical mutability in a being, but do not affect its unity as a substance. Thus, the unity of being can be combined with the hulomorphism, which assumes the plurality of forms, and this allows Peckham to argue differently from Aquinas on the very nature of the intellectual or rational soul. It is not pure form, but rather a substance, and a human being has therefore a plurality of forms, because the distinction between rational soul and body requires to think to the latter as provided of a form which acts in the mixture of the 4 elements according to the features proper of the human combination. This approach allows Peckham to more easily explain how the rational soul of each human being is able to exist also outside the hulomorphic union with the body. Its being the form of the body, in fact, certainly makes it the giver of life to the body, but does not involve the inseparability from it. The body, as John notes, does exist in its corporeality before the infusion of the human soul, which is the formal cause in the sense of being the cause of life for the body. However, it is not the unique form which operates in a body and causes its existence. Peckham notes, I quote, "Some of the forms are those that do not need to be kept in existence, as is the case with the human souls, or are the principles of life as they also live separate from the body. Others, on the other hand, are those forms which in the matter they vivify, receive the foundation of existence and complementarily give back living in those substances in which living and giving life and other things clearly coincide, because they die together with the body and arise from the principles of the body," end of quote. The idea that the rational soul's life does not depend on its simply being the giver of life to the human being, therefore of not being its unique substantial form, is a development of an argument that the master could found in the Summa Alensis concerning the way a living being can give life to another being, and therefore being in a certain sense its causal form. In answering the question, the Summa explains, following Avicenna, that the reason of the conjunction of a soul with the body is the desire of the former to bring the latter to life and to perfect it, that is, to bring the latter to act. In this basis, the text notes that this conjunction has multiple forms due to the multiple beings and presents this multiplicity as a series of degrees, so that in certain beings, the capability to create the conjunction is stronger and more effective than in others. The Summa continues with words that Peckham echoed in the quoted passage. I quote from the Summa, "In some beings, living and giving life to others coincide. Therefore, of some souls and bodies, there is a sort of single life or single fulfillment of life, as the beautiful case of the vegetative and sensitive souls. These, in fact, do not have of themselves some distinctive traits as regards life, if not what they draw from the body. Therefore, also for their own life, they depend on the body, and their life cannot be separated. In other entities, however, as in the rational soul, living and giving life to the body do not coincide, although it derives from the same thing, that is, from the same appetite, to the way it occurs with touch. Indeed, the rational soul has a life of its own, which is not of the body, but rather it is from it that it gives life to the body, and therefore these alone, by reason of the life that is proper to it, is separable from the body," end of quote. The different kinds of conjunction between the soul and the body, and the different kinds of relation between living and giving life that the Summa Alensis presents are the very background against which Peckham develops his idea of the plurality of forms. The rational soul, to act as the form of the body, does not need to be inseparable from matter and to be pure form. In such a case, in fact, the life of the rational soul and the life of the body will coincide, since the proper act of the human soul will be not to understand, but rather to give life to the human body, so that its life will be in act, only giving life to the body. And once this latter action will end, also the life of the human soul will lack its final cause. On the contrary, the degrees in living and giving life fixed in the Summa became in Peckham the degrees of this substantial form, which will be inseparable from matter, such as with the vegetative or sensitive, or separable, as in the case of the rational soul. The use of the Summa in Peckham's argument emerges also in the occasion of the discussion about the meaning of the term substantia and the possibility to signify through it the powers of the soul. The master notes that, with respect to the human soul, the term anima designates the intellect, that is, the soul that gives life to the human beings. And this soul is not a perfect unity, but rather it is composed by three substances, which correspond to 3 degrees of life. Such a discussion is present in both the Tractatus de Anima and in the Questiones de Anima. In the latter text, reacting against the hypothesis of the presence of a plurality of souls in the human being, Peckham argues in favor of the idea according to which, if it is impossible that a human being has more than one single soul, there is evidence of the presence of plural substances or spiritual natures in it, so that as the body is ordered to the soul, so one kind of life is ordered to the other, the vegetative to the sensitive, and these two to the rational. Tracing a distinction between the notions of soul as the cause of life, and therefore as the giver of life, and substance, the theologian explains, I quote, "Intellect is only meant by the name of soul. Therefore, by reason of this consideration, it can be said that in the human being there is only one soul that gives it life, made up of a triple substance and a triple kind of life, that is, the vegetative, the sensitive, and the intellectual. And the vegetative soul and the sensitive soul are distinctive of the species as regards the matter. Because just as the vegetative soul and the human being differs from that of the brutes as regards the species, so it also happens for the sensitive. From the point of view of the form, instead, the species is characterized by the intellectual soul, about which it can be said that it has sensation according to a certain similarity." End of quote. Such a theory that considers the soul as a unit but makes use of the notion of substance to designate the capabilities and the kind of life which depends on each capability could be found in the Summa Lensis in a passage which grounds the doctrinal position on the nature of the embryo. Here, the text of the Summa notes, I quote from the Summa, "Some argue, relying on Aristotle's statement cited above," it's a passage from the De Animalibus, "that the embryo lives before being organized and that it has a vegetative and sensitive soul before the infusion of the rational soul. And these same claim that the human being has three souls, or at least three substances, as if they were three lives, that is, the vegetative, the sensitive, and the intellectual. In fact, they affirm that the human being is an incorporeal substance thanks to which he lives, grows, and is nourished, and this depends on the graft in the generation in which it is in agreement with the plants. It also has an incorporeal substance, thanks to which it feels, which depends on the heavens and stars, according to which derives to him, without mediation from God, through creation. Therefore, they claim that there are three souls in the human being. Others affirm that although there are three substances in the human being, however, there are not three souls, because the term soul refers to perfection. Therefore, the vegetative substance is not a soul except in plants, of which it is perfection, while the sensitive one is not a soul except in the animals. But in the human being, these substances are as material principles with respect to reason, and the rational substance is the fulfillment, and therefore this alone is the soul in the human being, while the others exist as material dispositions with respect to it." End of quote. The Summa notes that, strictly speaking, it is contrary to Augustine's authority to affirm that the human being has a plurality of souls, but in doing so, it does not deny the value of the idea of three distinct principles, that is, the vegetative, the sensitive, and the rational, in the human soul. On the contrary, this text from the Summa suggests the possibility to argue in this direction by tracing a clear conceptual distinction between the notion of soul and that of substance. The same passage with the detailed description of this doctrinal position is quoted, for instance, by Bonaventure in his commentary on the sentences. Bonaventure stresses how the crucial point is the understanding of the notion of substance and the qualification of the soul in terms of substance. In his commentary on the sentences, Bonaventure more radically condemns as heresy the doctrine of the three souls in the human being, and then judges erroneous and contrary to Augustine the doctrine of the three substances, which he attributes to philosophy. Going back to Augustine, Bonaventure develops the argument of the Summa Lensis to support the theological solution, according to which the human soul is one in substance with different capabilities or faculties. Therefore, the human soul is one individual substance that perfects the human being through giving him life, sensation, and intelligence. Peckham's position, according to which the human soul is one and is responsible of the 3 degrees of life, because it has the faculties corresponding to each of these degrees, clearly stands on the doctrinal tradition which starts with the Summa Lensis and continues with Bonaventure. More in detail, Peckham is quite aware of the need to reshape the basic lexicon concerning the soul and its features and therefore he decides to make use of the Latin term substantia to signify not only a permanent being, but rather a property or capability of the being. According to him, when the sources call vegetative, sensitive, and intellectual soul substances, they do not signify three distinct beings, but on the contrary, three capabilities of the same subject, the human soul, which defines the species of the human being as regards the matter, vegetative and sensitive, and as regards the form, rational. In doing so, Peckham is able to offer a new understanding of the Aristotelian definition of the soul as the form of the body. The fact that the human being as one individual soul does not mean that these coincides with the intellectual and that this is the only substantial form of the body. On the contrary, the three capabilities or substances which are proper of this soul define the human being on the field of matter and on the field of the form, that is, the very nature of the human being qua human, that is, as a rational being. Peckham introduces a clear distinction on the one hand, the life of the human being qua human, that is, as a rational being whose proper form is the one that allows him to think and understand, is that which caused by the intellect. In this sense, the human soul is the form of the body, not because it is the cause of the organization of the matter of the body according to a certain structure and proportion. That is, the human soul is not the cause of corporeality. Rather, the human soul perfects and accomplishes the human body because it informs it according to the life of a rational being. This distinction of the life of the human soul qua human and of its role of giver of life to the body, to let it be a human body, leads Peckham to note that the death of an individual body does not involve the corruption and annihilation of its form, that is, of the human soul, because the role of form of the body, of the human body, concerns not the physical organization of this body, but only its living as the body of a human being. And following again an argument already stated in the Summa Lensi, Peckham notes that the human soul is connected to the body not to organize it, but by the desire, appetitus, to perfect it. In the Questiones de Anima, he notes, I quote, the soul wishes to be united with the body so that it can exercise in some sense difficult acts, either because of fragility, as in the state of innocence, or because of danger, as in the state of misery. Trained by the actions, the soul proceeds in the acquisition of noble disposition so that she, which is the least in the order of nature, can achieve by merit a condition superior to that of the angels, end of quote. The corporeality of the human being, on the contrary, depends on other causes, namely on the action of the formal principles which are responsible for the organization of the corporeal matter according to a certain order and structure. In introducing such a point of view, Peckham makes use of the Augustinian notion of rationes seminales, which you could find already exposed in the Summa Alensis, within a distinction between causal reasons and seminal reasons. While the first concern the form, that is, the reason because a thing is that thing, the latter concern matter, and namely its organization into a specific corporeality. The text of the Summa explicitly stresses that these seminal reasons are the equivalent of the virtue of the soul which Aristotle mentions as the cause of the corporeal organization of plants and animals, and notes, I quote from the Summa, so from these parts of the world, which according to Aristotle are full of the capacity of the souls, and which according to Augustine are full of the seminal reasons of which the word is pregnant, once the opportunity presents itself, as when the generative capability in the plant and in the animal, and the simple capacity contained in the same elements flow both with the capabilities of the first heaven or of the inferior heavens, depends the organization of the body and the ongoing production of the sensitive and vegetative soul, end of quote. The doctrine of the seminal reasons is the very ground of the distinction of corporeality from the effects of the action of the human soul as a form of the body. This role of the soul does not concern matter, but rather the perfection of the action of the body. The structure and order of the matter in the human body and its capability to exercise the vegetative and sensitive functions depend on the seminal reasons while the life of such a body as a human body depends on the action of the intellect. Peckham's doctrinal perspective is therefore deeply marked by the idea that the plurality of forms in the human being In the human being, the soul is the form of the body qua human, while the seminal reasons which are inherent to matter are its formal cause qua body. This point of view remarks the clear distinction between the soul and the body, reframing the Augustinian perspective of the double which composes the human nature. But in doing so, Peckham aims at including the hylomorphic principle in this understanding of the nature of the human being. I'm going to conclude. Facing to Aquinas' doctrine of the unicity of the substantial form, Peckham assumes a position deeply rooted in a tradition that goes back to the Summa Alensis and to a reading of the Aristotelian ideas on the soul-body problem, largely influenced by Avicenna and interpreted in the light of the Augustinian doctrinal inheritance. The Franciscan master shares with other contemporaries a series of theological doubts on the consequences of Aquinas' position, mainly with respect to the resurrection of Christ and the Eucharist. What William de la Mare fixes in his notorious Correctorium can be seen as the synthesis of a critical discussion of Aquinas' heritage, mainly from the point of view of theology. And such a discussion raised probably when Aquinas was still alive in the early 1270s among the masters of the University of Paris, but it didn't determine a changing, nor among the critics of the doctrine of the unity of substantial form, nor from Aquinas himself. Therefore, the discussion started and developed within the university as part of the complex cultural process of rethinking of theology, facing the philosophical innovations, mainly in the field of metaphysics and philosophy of nature, which came from the study of Aristotle and his Greek and Arabic tradition. 1277 is certainly a turning point, since the issue of the evaluation of certain doctrines of Aquinas became a matter of not only theological consistency, but also of orthodoxy. Etienne Tampier's intervention, and mainly Robert Kilwardby's list of condemned statements, are the witnesses of a qualitative leap in the discussion. The university masters, in fact, are called to give their doctrinal support and advice to an act of censure of the ecclesiastical authority, which prohibits the teaching of specific theories as contrary to the faith, including that of the unity of the substantial form. In other words, it is an act that has a legal and political value, which has a series of theological reasons in its background, and through the definition of the perimeter of orthodoxy, intends to underline the role and position of the ecclesiastical authority with respect to the university and its libertas. This latter, if it is recognized on the jurisdictional level of the governance of the community of masters and students, is however questioned with respect to the contents of the teaching. From the point of view of a bishop, in fact, the magisterium of those who teach in Paris and Oxford is required to be consistent with the magisterium of the successors of the apostles. This evident shift from a strictly academic and cultural field to a juridical and ecclesiastical one is what emerges from Peckham's own biography, specifically from the evaluation of his own involvement in the discussion on the unity and plurality of substantial form. The 1286 Act, in fact, represents the will to reaffirm the magisterial authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury and of the English Church with respect to the freedom of teaching of the university masters. The condemnation stated in London is not so much against Aquinas, but against the violation of Kilwardby's censorship of 1277, and therefore against the teaching of the doctrine of the unity of substantial form that the Thomists present in Oxford continue to provide. Quite remarkable on this point is the hiatus that emerges in the letters and documents of the Archbishop between the image of a pious and humble Aquinas and that of the arrogant Oxford Thomists. Therefore, Peckham's choice to detail the reasons of the condemnation, also on the theological ground, must be replaced within this framework, which involves ecclesiastical and religious motivations and shows the Archbishop in his capacity of primate of the English Church, rather than as a theologian who supports the plurality of substantial form against the unity professed by Aquinas. Certainly, Peckham's theological culture represents an essential basis for understanding the modalities and contents of the censor of 1286, which in fact echoes the theological discussion of 15 years before, when in Paris, in the presence of Aquinas himself, the unity of the substantial form had been discussed and criticized by the masters of theology, but following the plan of disciplinary confrontation. It is in that context that the Franciscan master matured his position, gathering from Aquinas the need to measure his theological reasoning with what emerged from the text of Aristotle and his interpreters. However, he also tried to remain faithful to a theological orientation, which is so fixed in the Summa Lensis. This text, in fact, was for Peckham a sort of herald of the opinio communis around which the theologians discovered the specificities of their own discipline. Thank you.